Where are you? Where do you kind of reside?
I'm in upstate New York these days. I've been up here for about 5 years.
Were you in the state before that? Yeah.
Yeah, I was in Brooklyn for about 10 years before that.
What made you kind of decide to escape? Or not escape, but move out?
It kind of felt like an escape at the time. I think there were a lot of factors at the time. I had been kind of flirting with the idea for a while, but never really saw a path to get out. And yeah, there were just some circumstances at the time, like, I kind of, because of like hearing issues I was having, I was needing to live a much quieter life. And I was at the time living on like a very main thoroughfare in Brooklyn, like right by the subway, right on an industrial truck route. It's extremely loud all the time. And yeah, there was kind of this moment where I had a couple of roommates move out, and rather than try and fill the space or find a new spot in the city, I decided to kind of follow them upstate and just kind of float around for a little while. It just, it felt like an interesting adventure to me at the time, and I think I was just needing a change, so I just kind of went with it.
Were the hearing issues caused from the kind of living next to a busy road for a few years? Was that kind of what spawned that?
No, I think that made it harder to recover from the issues, and it kind of exacerbated them after they set in. But most likely it was touring and performing and playing really loud shows that probably deteriorated some of the kind of natural protections that exist in the ear.
It just starts to take its toll.
Yeah. Yeah, your hearing can only put up with so much, as kind of like boring as it can seem to, or not cool as it can seem to protect your ears. Like, I definitely learned the hard way that it's really important, especially if you go to shows, if you like being up close, or you're a performer and you like playing your music loud, like you gotta protect it, because the price is really too great for not doing that.
Yeah. Do you kind of just put in the little earbuds?
Yeah, I ended up getting like molds made for my ears. They're like, I would alternate between the kind of like cheap pharmacy earbuds for a little while. But yeah, these days I have the kind of like fitted silicone molds that I would just, obviously not seeing any shows right now, but if I was on tour, like I'd be wearing them every night.
Yeah, I used to do the same, because I was kind of when I started going to like 4 or 5 shows a week. When you get to that point, you've kind of got to start protecting them. And then maybe on the odd show, if it was a band I was like really into or really loved, I might not wear them. But 9 times out of 10,
I think it's important for the long game. If you want to keep playing music, or you want to keep going to lots and lots of shows for the foreseeable future, like it's kind of a matter of longevity, which is not something you think about a lot when you're younger. You're not really thinking about like years ahead, but they catch up with you.
Are you a country boy to start with? Did you grow up in the city, or did you grow up in the countryside?
I grew up in the country, like not as far upstate as I am now. I kind of grew up outside of the city, in a kind of country suburb. So I think I think I am pretty adaptable, and whatever environment I'm in, I find a way to kind of match the energy there. And so living in the city in Brooklyn for so long, like it was a good fit for a while. And then I think my lifestyle started to change, and the things that I wanted in life started to change. The living in the country just started to make a lot more sense for everything else that I was trying to make happen in my life.
Have you noticed the impact the music you've made since you've been there? Like, if you compare the music you've made when you've been in the country compared to the stuff you made when you were in Brooklyn, can you see a difference as a result of that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the first music that I made since moving up here was my solo record, which is a very quiet record, and it's got lots of space, and the instrumentation is more kind of natural, organic, earthy, however you want to describe it. And I think that was partly from the shift of moving up here and there being so much quiet and so much personal space that it made its way into the music. And then with this new record, it's, sort of doubled down on the earthier aspects of it. I think there's just a sort of kind of warmer quality to the music that I'm making now, both the instrumentation and I think just the mood and the general vibe as well. And I'm very influenced by my surroundings, and I'm surrounded by nature a lot of the time, so it makes its way in.
Is that what kind of infused the title track on the new record? The way you're kind of describing the setting there?
Yeah, it was. The title is sort of a catch-all for describing this time of year. Not this time of year; it's very snowy right now. But the season between summer and fall, as the leaves are changing, and the parallel between that and the sort of changes that start happening in this phase of life.
Yeah. If you're in the right part of the world as well, it can kind of be the Goldilocks zone for weather. Not too hot, not too cold. It's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really nice. And I feel like there is this, for me, there's a very nostalgic feeling about that time of year, that feeling of the summer ending and a sort of almost cataloging of what your summer was or what the past year has been up until that point, and looking ahead into the winter, and it's a sort of energizing time too. I feel like you come back from the summer and get into the fall, and people are energized and kind of ready to pick up their work again, whatever that may be.
Yeah, the culture in America is a little bit different there. You take quite like a long break over summer, right? You guys pretty much have the whole summer off.
I guess it depends. I don't take a lot of like long breaks really, but that's because this is my job. So I'm kind of working all the time, and I take time off periodically from it, but I'm chipping away all the time. But I think most people, if they're going to go on vacation, a lot of the time they do it during the summer. I don't know if people get a lot of time off unless you're a teacher and you get the summers off, but I think it tends to be a time, definitely when I was living in the city, that was when, August was when the city would kind of clear out, and most people would go on vacation if they could, and the city got quieter, and it wasn't until September that people started to return and responding to their emails more, just kind of picking up where they left off after some period of like re-energization.
Do you find yourself working in a different way in the summer then, if you kind of have that space where you're still working and everyone else maybe isn't so much?
Well, it depends. I think that the summer can be, it's funny, I'm like trying to put myself back in the headspace of it being summer, and I'm looking outside at like a field full of snow.
What temperature is it?
It's actually not too bad today. It's about like 40 Fahrenheit right now. So the snow is like melting a bit, and we kind of like feel the spring on the horizon.
Feel it coming.
It's still not summer. But I feel like in the summer, it's like this pull to be outside for me, wanting to be more efficient with the way I work so that I'm not spending all day inside, but getting out into the world, into nature, which informs the process too. I think because so much of it revolves around creation and generating ideas and kind of getting into the right mindset to make something, you need to step outside of the work environment sometimes to get some information, I guess.
Yeah, it's almost like collecting those experiences that you then distill into the music itself.
Yeah, and sometimes ideas just kind of coalesce by going on a walk or spending some time in nature and working things out in your head, away from distractions, away from a lot of things. Just, time spent thinking and making connections, and, sometimes some very important realizations and aha moments happen just walking in the woods.
I think it was Charles Dickens who used to walk like 20 miles a day while he was writing.
Really? Wow, 20 miles a day. God, that's a lot. That's like the whole day.
Yeah, I'm trying to work out how many hours. I mean, if you're doing like 4 miles an hour, that's like 5-6 hours maybe walking.
Yeah.
It's a lot, yeah.
That's great. Something to aspire to.
I had John from Wild Pink on yesterday, actually.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he says hi. But yeah, he was out for a walk when we were doing the podcast, and it was kind of a similar thing. We were speaking about, how it gets your mind going just in that way. Do you speak to other songwriters about this?
Yeah, actually. Well, he and I actually talked about a lot of this stuff a few weeks ago. But yeah, I like trading notes with other songwriters, other creators in general, just about like their process and the kind of like cross training they do. The things that aren't actually writing a song or working on their actual piece itself, but the things that kind of help inform their process or help get their mind in shape for whatever work comes later.
How much of your process, the kind of songwriting process, do you feel is formed from self-discovery and working it out yourself, and how much has come from trading ideas like that and taking inspiration from other people?
I'd say it's probably a healthy mix, especially in the last few years, as I've just become interested in getting ideas for other artists or from other artists' process. And sometimes that's talking to a friend or peer. Sometimes it's just reading about other artists' rituals. And sometimes it doesn't have to be artists. Sometimes it's just productive people that you admire and getting some insight into their routines and kind of deconstructing some of their habits and trying things out, seeing what works, what doesn't.
Are you a creature of habit, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that can be good or bad habits. But, over the last few years, I've definitely made the effort to kind of harness that tendency and try and fill it with what I consider healthy habits.
Is that partially what Just One Sec was about? Trying to maybe move away from some of those bad habits and become free of them? Or become free of yourself as a person, I guess, more so. But
yeah, I think it's more so. I guess it does kind of pertain to habit, but less about activity and process, and more, I guess, about a habitual way of interacting with somebody that you've known for a really long time. This, I think there's this kind of phenomenon that happens with really close friends and family where you sort of in a conversation feel you can predict how they're going to respond to something you say. It's a little bit telepathic, but it's actually, I think, just this kind of like habitual preempting of somebody because you know them so well. And it's kind of unfair in a way. It doesn't leave a lot of room for someone to surprise you.
Yeah. And it could also be you then have to kind of wonder how much of it is projecting.
Totally. Yeah, I think that that becomes really tricky. And I think that song especially is about trying to see somebody with fresh eyes, somebody you know really, really well, and admitting that you actually don't know what they're thinking and you don't know exactly how they will respond to something that you say, and, letting them be new again, hoping that they'll offer you the same in kind.
Can that be trickier than changing your own habits because it's like a two-way thing, if you know what I mean? It's not just down to you.
Yeah, I think, ultimately, it does come down to changing your own habits. You can't really change somebody else, I don't think, or you shouldn't count on being able to change somebody else or change their behavior. I think the best you can do is try to catch yourself when you are when you're kind of filling in the blanks for somebody else, or when you are kind of boxing them in with expectations. To catch yourself and say, okay, like I'm so full of anticipation about how I expect them to respond that I'm not even really giving them a fair chance.
Yeah, and if you do that as well, what could actually be transition and growth can feel like lost to you, even though it's not. Like if you have that expectation.
Like it can be loss of this way of identifying a person or way of knowing them, do you mean?
Yeah, it's like that thing when people always say, you've changed, if you know what I mean. Like when they say that, they're not saying it in a good way, they're saying it in a, I wish you were still the old person way, which is such a weird thing to think about because everyone's going to change. Yeah,
it's inevitable. It's really a fact of life that people change. So much of what this record's about is reconciling with that. It's hard to watch people you love change and become less recognizable to you. Ideally, you encourage that change and you change in response to it and with it, and you give somebody space to become different. Some friendships and relationships can't survive that change, and it's not necessarily a failing on anybody's part. It's just that it's not always possible to ride that change out. But it can feel like a loss. It can feel like a loss when somebody that you felt like you had a really good read on becomes less predictable to you.
Yeah, and I think as well, if they're changed as a result of someone else, like if they're surrounding themselves with people that are changing them in a negative way, that's when it starts to feel like a loss, because it doesn't feel like them that's changing themselves. It feels like an external thing that you can't control.
Absolutely. I think that's like a common problem with when a close friend gets involved, in a relationship with somebody new, and they, for better or worse, start to have a strong influence on them. And this person that you thought you knew inside and out is suddenly taking on characteristics of somebody you've just met. And it's disorienting, and it can be hard to accept it.
Has that ever happened to yourself as well? Like aspects of yourself change that you thought never would?
Absolutely. That was what a lot of hospice was about, actually. I definitely lost myself in the course of a relationship and, lost my center. And I think the people that knew me really well were very confused by my behavior and the changes that were happening in me, as if somebody else was kind of pulling my strings.
The thing with that narrative as well, though, it feels like it was coming from a place of goodwill, like you were trying to help someone.
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. I think there was definitely a lot of effort spent trying to help someone and trying to be a good partner and be generous. But there's also this other aspect of having been so young and not having a great sense of self yet, almost, hoping for an opportunity to become somebody else, which is, I was going to say indefensible. That's not quite the right word, because I don't mean to like cast judgment on myself or anybody who finds himself in that situation. But I think it's something to be very careful of when you meet somebody who has qualities that you find very attractive, to not lose yourself in your relationship with them, to, make sure you hold on to what is steady about you. And it's hard to, at that age, I think it's hard to even know what it is you ought to be holding on to.
It can be tough as well, because like what you're saying there, that you see characteristics in this person that you admire. The whole reason we get into relationships is so that, because we see those characteristics and we want to see those characteristics in ourselves as well. But it can be tough not to absorb their negative qualities too. It's tough to kind of distinguish and just take the positive things and try and give the positive things. You end up passing everything over.
Yeah, and it's really hard to cherry pick somebody's attributes and choose the ones that you want to influence you. I think it's possible, but it's not a great course of action. And I think in opening yourself up to a relationship, you sort of accept that you will be influenced by it, both somebody's more favorable attributes and the ones that, you might call flaws. I think that's inevitable.
You mentioned something a little while back as well, that when you were in that kind of place in your life, you didn't have a great sense of self at that point because you were so young.
Mm-hmm.
At what point do you feel like you gained a full sense of self, and then how has that impacted you creatively since, and the way you express yourself creatively now that you have that?
I think these days I'm closer to that than I've ever been. I don't think I've ever achieved a full sense of self, but I think I have a stronger sense of self than I used to, certainly in my 20s. And I think my move out of the city probably helped that, just by not seeing as many people around all the time, not being in an environment where I was kind of encountering so many others and having so much of other people reflected back at me at the time.
Yeah. No matter whether we like it or not, when we're around other people, we change. We act to a certain degree. We're different people around others. Is part of the reason that you've got a stronger sense of self now, because when you're by your own a little bit more, you have more time just to be yourself?
I think so. I think maybe I've embraced some qualities of my personality that maybe I was less willing to in the past, less comfortable with in the past. And, I think there's a tendency living in a big city or living in a really cool neighborhood that you can't help but kind of not only compare yourself to the people that you either know or even just see on the street, but if you are somebody who is struggling to know who they are, it can make you a bit like a chameleon and feel like you can you can kind of try on any version of a person and sort of, take on any role. And at some point, those roles, as defined by other people, can put you, create like a tension in your life, I guess. A sense of tension, a sense of being, your behavior being at odds with who you really are.
Is it harder to achieve fulfillment in life when that's going on?
I think it's harder to know what would be fulfilling in life. I think you might find yourself chasing the wrong ambitions.
It's that old saying, isn't it? Comparison is the death of joy.
I've never heard that, but that's good.
I can't remember who said that, but it is good. It was there was a line on the album. I think it's on Wheels Roll Home. Is it the first line where you said there's a point way out past the present tense?
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me, I think, and you're a fan of him as well, Rumi.
Oh, yeah.
The quote by Rumi, out beyond ideas of right and wrong, there's a field and I'll meet you there. It brought my mind there.
Yeah, I love that line.
Can the creative process be that for you? Like that idea of being in a place like that that's completely pure and ideas of right and wrong are gone?
I've spent some time trying to kind of answer that question or trying to work from that place, that kind of metaphysical place, since Familiars, really, to try and write songs and specifically lyrics that explore a subject without being judgmental and without establishing a sense of right and wrong. I think it's kind of a slippery place to work from. If you're not careful, it can lead to saying nothing, or it can lead to a kind of both sidesism, or a kind of like relativistic perspective where like everybody's right and everybody's wrong. And on some kind of cosmic level, I do believe that, but I think it's hard to navigate your life purely thinking in those terms and never, mistaking judgment for discernment and mistaking this idea that I'm never going to decide what I think is right and wrong, and confusing that with kind of discerning your own sense of right and wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's kind of what makes it is what it is powerful, though. Because that's a song that has its inherent political connotations. But I think the fact that you don't really pass judgment and you kind of, in the same way as the title, you just state it for what it is, it kind of makes that a lot more striking.
Yeah, and I think that song was kind of written from a bit of a detached place, which is another kind of risk of writing from that field where there's no sense of right and wrong. You can mistake non-attachment for detachment or vice versa. But, to me, that felt like a real feeling that can come up, a kind of a distanced feeling from something that's actually very difficult and very painful, but a sort of being resigned to the outcome, kind of able to recognize pain, recognize sadness, but it doesn't register with you and you just accept it.
It's almost less of an experience.
Yeah. It can be less visceral. Yeah, I think there can be value to some degree of that in your life, to having a bit of remove from some of the more difficult things. It also means having a bit of a remove from the more positive things in your life, and it can be kind of cold and unfeeling. But I tend to think that part of what is so valuable about the experience of being alive is that we're not in this kind of disembodied plane of existence where, our consciousness is free floating among all other consciousness. Like maybe we are, but I think part of the value of the human experience is that we have this opportunity to feel all of these things, and that oftentimes they're very ugly feelings and they're very unpleasant. Sometimes they're really beautiful and joyful, that on some level we ought to let ourselves feel them.
Are these revelations we've kind of been talking about, are they something that's come partially from meditation and that kind of practice that you've implemented in your life?
Yeah, I would say so. I started meditating about 7 or 8 years ago, and I think it definitely changed the way I think about a lot of these things. But it hasn't been a linear change in thought. I think I've gotten some ideas about how I think the universe works, or how I want to be in the world, and then I've sort of recognized that I jumped the gun, or that I didn't understand what I was experiencing exactly, or I was oversimplifying things. And, so there's this constant revision going on, this constant checking of my worldview to make sure that I don't land on some kind of one-size-fits-all solution for myself. That, different situations call for different reactions. And, like, for example, tempering your reactivity to difficult situations doesn't mean not reacting to anything. But at the start of learning to meditate, it can seem like that's the answer, that you just need to be completely stoic and made of stone and non-reactive. And I think it's, lately for me, it's been about being more just aware of the reactions that are happening internally and catching myself before reacting externally in a way that will hurt somebody or cause suffering.
Do you ever implement that in the creative process as well? Because that's so much of that is about reacting to ideas and melodies and such.
Yeah, I think creatively, especially on this last record, it's actually I think creatively lately I've been trying to not catch myself, because I think that can lead to essentially a form of writer's block, where you get too locked up in your head, or your ideas get too locked in your head and they don't have an opportunity to make it onto the canvas. I'm trying to recognize what reactions are happening, but letting them happen. A creative canvas of any kind is sort of a safe place for you to react however you do to whatever prompt you've got. It can be very telling, but for me, I've got to see it all on the page first, or I've got to see it in the session or whatever it is. And then from there, it's a matter of editing. It's a matter of deciding, okay, what makes it through to be shared with other people.
How far or how long will you typically develop an idea before deciding to reject it? Is part of that, and letting and letting your mind run, do you have to say, I'm going to let this go as far as it can? Do you have to try and stop yourself cutting it off early?
That's a very good question. If I reject an idea, a lot of the time it's because I just recognize that it's not working, and that it's not coming together the way that I want it to. And that it's not necessarily that it was a bad idea to begin with, but I don't know how to execute it, or I don't know how to finish it, or make it consumable, make it listenable or understandable.
Can that be frustrating when you get that feeling from the initial spark, but you just can't quite get it to the place that it feels like it needs to be?
Yeah, it can be. It's very frustrating. There's like a tendency for denial in that too. Sometimes a subpar idea will make it very far along the process, and it's not till the 11th hour that you realize this just isn't working. I'll spend a lot of time kind of trying to force it to work. And if the editor in me is deceived for too long, sometimes those things slip through and they make it onto the finished project.
How far did you develop the idea for this being a double album before letting that fall?
I wasn't really attached to that idea, but this was the first time that I had so many more songs throughout the process that were kind of being workshopped. Usually we would write enough songs to kind of reach the threshold of an album length, and then work on refining those and finishing those. And this time we got to that point and just kept going and kept writing and seeing what else was in there. For a period of time, it seemed like there were, close to 20 songs that could make it onto this album. But that's one of the kind of deceptions that happen earlier in the recording process, where every idea seems like it has potential. And every idea kind of does have potential, but I tend to underestimate how much work will go into bringing an initial idea to completion. And so you get a little further on in the process and you say either, I don't want to work on this idea anymore, or I don't see a path for it, or it is similar to another idea in this group, but the other idea is better.
Well, you were saying there that sometimes you don't see, how much development it's going to take. Can that be part of the excitement of the process too, though? Because it's surprising you in that way if you didn't foresee it taking that much work.
Yeah, I think it's all this process of finding out and developing an idea, especially when you sort of see the path, but there's enough room for spontaneity. I think it can be a lot of fun. And in a lot of ways, it's much more fun than starting with the blank canvas and just doing what I try to do now, which is show up every day and say, all right, are there any ideas today, starting from scratch? And most days there's not. Like there's something, there's maybe some chords, maybe a melody, maybe a riff, but in a lot of cases, it's just kind of searching. When you land on something that you think is cool, it's very rewarding. When you land on something that you can see developing it, then it's exciting. But sometimes the point of it is not for it to be finished, if that makes sense. It's for you to kind of get a certain distance down the line with an idea, only to realize that some of those developments that you made with this idea would be better applied to something else you're working on. And then you just gotta kill your darlings. You gotta get rid of the thing that's not working and salvage what you can if there's something worth salvaging.
Do you mean in that sense that you might develop an idea that's not going to make it, but it sparks something for another idea that does?
Yeah, exactly.
How do you ensure it kind of still feels cohesive then? If the ideas are all kind of feeding into each other like that, how do you ensure that you preserve what was at the heart of that initial idea that made it so special and sparked your attention in the first place?
Well, I think ideas being able to be kind of transferred or moved around within this batch of songs, I think it actually makes it more cohesive stylistically and in terms of mood and like environment. But it can be hard to preserve the initial spark of what made something interesting to you. And sometimes when you re-record a demo, it loses whatever that magic is, which can be disappointing and frustrating. Then again, it can also be a really valuable signpost to show you that the idea doesn't stand up to repetition or recreation. I think there's value in like a spontaneous recording that just has captured some magic. But I think in songwriting, it can be very telling if you can't re-record a song and have it capture that same energy.
In terms of the song, maybe just isn't quite special enough.
Yeah, like the thing that was maybe special about it in that initial recording is something other than the song. Something more subtle, something about, the tone of the instrument or the energy that you played it with, but it's not necessarily the song itself. It can be hard to pull that stuff out, though. It can be hard to extract those kinds of raw, visceral qualities and apply them to a different idea.
It's almost like a Where's Waldo puzzle. You're trying to find out where that thing is, but you just can't quite get a hold of it sometimes.
Yeah.
Where, or when rather, did you start to bring in the nature recordings and the kind of field recordings?
I've been doing field recordings for several years now. Probably I think I started doing a lot of them around the time of Familiars. Once I think technology on phones improved, or microphones on phones improved, and I would carry a field recorder around with me sometimes as well. Especially when I was traveling more, I would just find myself in these environments that I knew I would almost never return to again, and capturing a field recording is in some ways the best way to transport yourself back to that place. For me, anyway. My memory can be very easily triggered by sound, and getting a sense of space and the elements in that space is very transportative for me. And so for this record, knowing that I was going to be, like most records, like it's a time capsule, and that I'm capturing this moment in time and the place that it was made in and everything that was happening at the time, feeling like recording what those environments sounded like at the time like the ambient environmental sounds would contribute to that, ability to time travel back to that period of time. And it was actually fortunate that I did, because I ended up having to move out of the studio that I recorded it in, or the garage that was converted into a studio. I had to move out of that house just as I was finishing this record. So all of those field recordings plus these songs really came to encapsulate that place and time in my life in a way that I couldn't have anticipated.
So did you finish up the record after you'd moved?
Michael and I finished all of our tracking right before I started packing up the house. And then we mixed the record after the move. But I sort of knew that a window was closing and that it would be hard to pick up that sort of generative part of the process in a new location. And moving takes all your time and attention once you get into it. And once you're breaking down everything and packing up and getting settled in a new spot, it's all consuming. So I just recognized like some part of me was probably going to move on in that process, and I needed to get all of this while I could.
Did you have to kind of settle in a new place before you went back to working on it? Did you need to feel comfortable there and take a little bit of time to settle in before you went back to the record?
Well, I didn't mix the record at my place. I mixed it at my friend Nick Principe's studio, about 20 minutes from here. I was going there pretty much every day while we mixed it. And meanwhile, like in my time in between mixing sessions was, unpacking, getting the new studio set up. And it took a little while for me to start making music again, just because of how much time it takes to get settled in a new spot. And plus I was just consumed with mixing Green to Gold. I was trying to kind of keep my head in that space while I was, doing the deep zoom in that mixing is.
How many days in were you mixing for?
Oh God, we mixed for weeks. We mixed for a really long time.
It almost sounds like a little bit more of is that a little bit more of a right and wrong process in the songwriting thing?
How do you mean?
Does it ever feel, when you're mixing, because you were saying that you're going in every day and there's a routine and a structure to it, does it feel a little bit more workmanlike than the actual songwriting process itself?
Yeah, I think it's definitely using a different part of the mind. It's really it's less about coming up with new ideas and more about listening very, very carefully and closely and paying attention and kind of staying focused, which is different than spitting out ideas and evaluating those ideas and seeing what works. There is a certain amount of listening that's happening during that time, but you're not going over it with a fine-tooth comb. But, every stage of making a record is another stage of zooming in, essentially. And any record is just, 100,000 brush strokes. And then eventually you reach the end of it where you've kind of zoomed in too much and you need to step back, kind of experience it as a whole to see if it's done. Yeah,
you need to start looking at the brush strokes and see it as a painting.
Exactly.
Does the painting sometimes change shape with time? In terms of after it's been completed and you kind of move further away
after it's done?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reliable, actually. Although I don't think the thing itself changes. I think that the creator changes. As you get more distance from something you've made, you gain different perspective on it. And so what you thought you were writing about at the time remains true, but with, years having passed and looking back at yourself, you can see what it was really about. You can see a bit more of the picture of what was going on. Just having that third person perspective on your younger self. So it starts to sound different. I think also with time passing, you naturally zoom out and you hear it in a way that you can't while you're working on it. Some of these sort of like obsessive details that seemed so loud and present to you while you were recording or mixing or mastering, they get lost in the soup, basically. When you have a little time away from it, you stop being able to identify where those tiny details were. If you're like combing through one audio track in a song, looking for like a microscopic pop or click, and it, it can kind of plague your existence while you're doing it. And you need to have that kind of attention to find those little unwanted imperfections in the audio. A year or two later, you're not going to remember where that was. And if you missed one, unless it's a glaring pop or click, you're probably not going to hear it.
Have you ever missed one and you've spotted it later on?
Probably. But again, I couldn't tell you where it is.
Is it easier for you to have perspective on something like the music videos that you're accompanying this with? Or I guess the visual series, I should say. Because you're doing like a 10-part you're doing a video for every song, basically, right?
Right. Yeah. It's essentially a visual album. Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is that I'm way less involved in that process because I didn't make the music videos. I didn't direct them. I didn't write them. I didn't film them, and I didn't edit them. I'm not zooming in the way that the director is, and I'm not zooming in the way that in this case, the dancers are, thinking about their performance and their movement. I get to experience it from a much more zoomed out perspective, which is really nice, actually. I get to just kind of consume it as a fan of their work. I don't have insight into the kind of microscopic qualities that go into it. So I get to, the illusion isn't broken for me, which makes it really enjoyable too. Because there is a point with working on a record and especially in the closing stages of it where you are working on it so microscopically and obsessively that you periodically kind of hate it because you get so tired of it, and it kind of haunts you while you're working on it, and you get so fixated on it and so frustrated with it that you get tired of doing it. You get tired. You just want it to be done already. And so it's so nice that with these videos, I'm nowhere close to that part of the process. I mostly get to just experience it when it's more or less done.
With a lot of this record, I know a lot of it kind of came from conversations, right? That was kind of the basis that started to propel some of these ideas. Was that the idea behind the music video then, to kind of have it be like a silent conversation, like a physical conversation almost, by using the dancers?
Yeah, exactly. I think, like you said, the physical conversation that's happening between the two of them is this sort of parallel story to the story on the album. I think it's not mirroring it exactly. It's sort of reinterpreted and translated for different people, which is what you hope for with any songwriting or storytelling, is that despite there being specifics that are drawn from your own experience, that they can somehow be translated to somebody else who had a different experience, but that something about it will be common.
Can you hear the influence of specific conversations you had in the album? Like when you hear a song, is your mind ever kind of drawn back to a particular experience and a particular conversation that you had with someone that informed the process of this?
A lot of the time I'm drawn to the environment, the scenery, I kind of seeing a landscape. And so for me, it might be what the landscape or the surroundings were when that conversation happened, not necessarily the words of the conversation itself. But, like Wheels Roll Home, I'm remembering my partner's car coming down the driveway after being gone for a while. Porch Light is, that brings to light me taking our dog for a walk at, in the dark at night on like a foggy night.
That's interesting, because whenever I heard that, I always kind of got the early Sunday morning type thing from it.
Oh, really? Yeah, it does have that sound more. It doesn't really sound like nighttime to me, but I think maybe because the kind of imagery of walking in the dark that is happening throughout it, like that's just where my mind goes.
When you're going out for walks in the dark as opposed to walks in the light, does your mind go to different places?
I think in the dark, your mind has a tendency to fill in the blanks, has a tendency to kind of fill in that darkness with imagination. During the daytime, you're really registering everything that you can see around you.
How are you finding it with the snow at the moment then? Because you kind of get that reflection where everything feels a lot lighter at night.
I love that. Yeah, if you have that combination of the snow on the ground and the moon in the sky, yeah, you don't like on a dark night. I would otherwise be walking the dog with like a headlamp, and it's nice when it's just everything is kind of illuminated outside, and you can just walk out there and you can see everything. It's weird too. It's weird for it to be so bright at night. It just casts everything a little bit differently.
You feel like an owl.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you're like, this is what it looks like all the time for them.
Until it starts snowing, and then you get caught in a blizzard and suddenly you can't see anything.
Yep, that's right.
What was the last conversation you had with someone where you felt like you learned something?
Gosh, that's a good question. I was talking to my mom the other day, and I was telling her about just having very active dreams lately. them being just kind of exhausting. And she gave me the very good advice that I should start doing dream recall, basically, and kind of treat them as prompts for new writing ideas. And I guess just something about the way that the idea was kind of framed to me just felt very insightful in a way where, it was kind of revelatory for me, because here I was trying to kind of solve this problem and trying different approaches to essentially suppress my dreams. And her advice was to look at them and to kind of investigate what they're trying to tell me.
I really like that. Taking like a positive, or taking something that you feel like is a negative aspect of yourself and turning it into an advantage.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of like what we were speaking about earlier with, holding on to certain aspects of yourself. Like maybe when you're younger, there's certain things that you want to rid yourself of, but what you really should be doing is like accepting them and finding a way to use them to your advantage. And
I think that's one of the bigger truths in life. I spent so much of my childhood and like kind of early adult life trying to be different than how I actually was, rather than just leaning in to who it was, the kind of person that I seemed to be. I wish I had embraced it sooner. But I guess maybe that journey is important too. You have to kind of come back to yourself after losing yourself for a little while to really see the value.